I counted the money 3 times before I believed it. $7. 7 worn bills sewn into the hem of my skirt, everything I owned after selling my mother's wedding ring in Chicago. The pawnbroker had weighed it on a scale that looked older than God, his fingers stained yellow from decades of tobacco. He'd offered $5. I'd asked for 9. We'd settled at 7 because 7 was the number that let me buy a train ticket west with enough left over to eat twice before Montana. The arithmetic was clear. $18 a month for 7 months meant I'd have $126 by spring. Enough to start over. Enough to prove I could survive without anyone. If I lived that long. The Northern Pacific Railway platform in Montana Territory smelled like creosote and distance. August 1886. The wood planks beneath my boots looked more like a pile of boards nailed to dirt than a real station. Behind me, the train hissed and groaned, ready to pull away and leave me standing in a place that felt less like arrival and more like abandonment. I had one trunk, one letter of employment, one moment to decide if I was brave or just desperate. My mother had died 3 months ago. Typhoid, the kind that turned a person yellow and hollow before it finally granted mercy. I'd held her hand through the last night, felt her pulse slow beneath my fingers until it simply stopped. The way a clock stops when you forget to wind it. The doctor's bill had taken everything except the ring. Selling the ring had taken the last piece of her I could hold. My father had abandoned us when I was 10, just walked out one winter morning and never came back. My younger brother had died in a factory accident, at 14 crushed between machinery that kept running even as he bled out on the floor. The foreman had offered us $12 in compensation. My mother had thrown it back in his face. I was 23 years old and had nothing I was afraid to leave behind. The wagon driver didn't speak during the 70-mile journey across open grassland. He was a man who'd crossed this land too many times to find it interesting anymore. I didn't mind the silence. I'd had enough of people in Chicago telling me what I couldn't do, shouldn't try, would certainly fail at. The silence of Montana felt like permission. The land stretched so far and so flat that the sky felt like a ceiling pressing down. For 3 days, the Judith Mountains stood on the horizon without getting closer. They floated in the distance like a promise that refused to arrive. I watched them from the wagon bench and counted the ways I could fail. Run out of money, run out of food, run out of warmth, run out of time. The list grew longer with each mile. The Hartwell Ranch appeared slowly from the grassland. Low wooden buildings scattered across the valley, with haystacks and fencing spread around them like pieces of a puzzle built by hard work instead of planning. A woman met me at the gate. She was compact, maybe 50 years old, with gray hair at her temples and eyes that studied people without judging them, but didn't miss anything worth noticing either. Her voice carried across the yard, with the authority of someone who'd learned to make herself heard over wind and distance. Rebecca Clark. Yes, ma'am. Kathleen Moore. We'll skip the pleasantries. You're here to herd sheep through winter at the line camp 12 miles north. $18 a month room and board. 240 animals. Supply ride once a month until snow gets too deep. Then you're alone until spring. Still interested. I met her eyes and saw something familiar there. The particular exhaustion of a woman who'd survived by being twice as competent as any man who tried to replace her. Yes. She showed me the supply shed first. 50 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of beans, coffee salt, a cracked cast iron stove left behind by the previous herder. When I touched the cracked leg of the stove, Kathleen watched me carefully. Her words came quietly, but they landed like stones dropping into still water. A person who pays attention will outlast a person who is simply strong. I nodded. The crack ran diagonal across the stove's front leg, deep enough that I could slip my fingernail into the gap. Metal fatigue. The kind that started small and widened under heat until the whole thing collapsed. Whoever had used this stove had known it was failing and left it anyway. Kathleen's voice shifted something harder underneath. The last herder lasted 4 months. Before that, 2 months. Before that, well, you'll read about it. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face still. What happened to them? Winter. She said it like it was the only explanation needed. Montana doesn't care how tough you think you are. It just waits. The line camp sat 12 miles north across open range. I rode there alone on a gray horse that knew the path better than I did. The animal moved with the resigned patience of something that had carried too many hopeful people to the same destination and watched most of them leave in worse condition than they'd arrived. The cabin appeared slowly from the grassland. 12 feet by 14. Pine boards nailed upright. A roof patched with tar paper that looked like it had been applied by someone who ran out of materials halfway through and decided close enough was good enough. One crooked window facing east glass, so old it had ripples like frozen water. I stepped inside and felt my lungs tighten. Wind didn't move through cracks. It moved through the walls themselves. I held my hand in the center of the room and felt cold air brush my palm like invisible fingers reaching through from outside. Daylight slipped through thin seams between boards. Old newspaper stuffed into the gaps had turned soft and brown with age. It was insulation in name only. I traced the wall with one finger and felt the boards shift slightly under pressure. The whole structure seemed to exhale when the wind pushed against it. This wasn't a cabin. This was a box with gaps. A sieve that would let winter pour through and fill the space where I was supposed to sleep. On the north wall, someone had carved initials into the wood. RW 1884. Below it, RW 1885. Below that, barely visible scratched words. If you're reading this, The sentence stopped. Just ended mid-thought. The last letters, shallow and uneven like whoever had carved them had lost strength or nerve or time. I ran my fingers over the incomplete message and felt something cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the draft. Ryan Walker, the previous herder. Whatever he'd wanted to say, he hadn't survived long enough to finish it. I stood quietly in the center of the room and counted what I had. 1 cracked stove, 2 cords of firewood stacked against the north wall, 240 sheep grazing the hills, a supply ride from Kathleen Moore once a month until the snow became too deep. After that, I'd be alone until spring. And $7. The mental arithmetic came automatically the way it always did when survival narrowed into simple numbers. 2 cords of wood. Each cord would last maybe 4 weeks if I burned carefully. 8 weeks total. Montana winters lasted 16. The distance between 8 and 16 was not something hope could fill. It was a sentence already written. The ride to White Sulphur Springs took most of the morning. The town smelled like every place people went to forget where they came from. Wood smoke, horse manure, and the particular desperation of men trying to convince themselves they'd made the right choice heading west. False front buildings lined the dirt street, trying hard to look taller and stronger than they really were. Inside the general store, a man stood behind the counter with the weathered patience of someone who'd spent years watching people arrive with hope and leave with something else. Gray-beard spectacles pushed up on his forehead, the look of a banker who'd learned to measure risk in human faces. His eyes took in my worn traveling coat and the careful way I didn't quite meet his gaze. "You're the new herder at Moore's Line Camp. Rebecca Clark. Kenneth Taylor. What do you need? Firewood." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "How much?" "7 cords." The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was simply honest. He leaned forward on the counter, hands flat on the worn wood. "That'll be $17.50, plus delivery." I felt the walls of possibility closing in the familiar sensation of arithmetic tightening around my throat. "How much is delivery?" $2. $19.50 total. I had 7. Kenneth's voice dropped lower, not unkind but tired. "How much money do you have?" The question hung in the air between us. I could lie. I could walk out. I could pretend the math wasn't what it was. Instead, I met his eyes and gave him the truth, because lying wouldn't change the numbers. $7. He studied me for a long moment. "I've been here 18 years. I've seen ranchers with more money than you fail every winter. The ones who make it out here usually have money, family, or luck." His pause carried the weight of all those failures he'd witnessed. "And sometimes none of those are enough." My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against my skirt to hide it. "I can work 2 days a month through October here in the store, stocking shelves, inventory, whatever you need, in exchange for an extra cord of wood." Kenneth's eyes narrowed, calculating. 2 days a month for 2 months. That's 4 days of labor for $5 worth of wood. You're overpaying. I'm buying time to find another solution. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite respect, but recognition. The look of someone seeing their own younger self making the same desperate mathematics. 3 cords for $7, including delivery. First 2 days you work, I want inventory of the back storage. It's a mess. 3 cords, 12 weeks of heat, 4 weeks short of spring. But at least I'd bought myself time. The words slipped out before I could stop them, rough with something that might have been gratitude or just exhaustion. "Thank you." Kenneth's response was quiet. "Don't thank me yet. 3 cords won't get you to April, but maybe you'll figure out the rest before January kills you." Outside the store, I stood on the wooden walkway and fought the urge to sit down and cry. My hands were still shaking. 4 weeks short. 4 weeks where the stove would go cold and the cabin would become a tomb, and I would freeze the way Ryan Walker had frozen mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-hope. Near the door sat a shelf of secondhand goods, estate sales, abandoned homesteads, belongings left behind by people who'd given up or died trying. A small notebook caught my eye. The cover read, "Ryan Walker, 1884 to 1885, in careful handwriting." I looked around. Kenneth was helping another customer inside. Nobody watching. I slipped the notebook into my coat pocket and walked away with my heart hammering. First moral compromise, small theft, the cost of survival paid in inches. That night, I read Ryan Walker's notebook beside the dim glow of the stove. His notes were neat and careful. Temperature records, wood usage calculations, observations about wind patterns and snow accumulation. He had been methodical, precise, everything I would have been in his place. He'd faced the same problem I had. The cabin leaked heat. The wood supply was too small. His solution had been to pack straw into the gaps between the boards. October 15th, 1884, packed north wall with straw. Draft reduced by half. Estimate 30% improvement in heat retention. November 3rd, 1884. Rain-soaked straw. Some sagging. Will monitor. November 28th. 1884 straw frozen solid in walls. Creates moisture against wood, beginning to smell of rot. December 19th, 1884. Removed wet straw from south wall. Mold underneath. Straw method failing. January 19th, 1885. Still cold. Hands barely work. Can't feel. The sentence stopped. The ink trailed off into nothing. I sat there in the silence of the cabin and understood with absolute clarity that I was reading the last words of a man who had frozen to death in this room, possibly in this chair, possibly wrapped in the same blanket I was using now. I closed the notebook slowly. Ryan Walker had tried. He had been careful. He had used logic and observation and methodical testing. And he had died anyway. The arithmetic was clear. I had the same cabin, the same walls, the same impossible problem. What made me think I could do better with 3 cords when he'd failed with however many he'd managed to gather? The answer was simple and terrible. I didn't think I could do better. I just didn't have the option of quitting. Early September brought colder nights than I'd expected. On the 3rd morning of the month, I woke to frost on the inside of the cabin window. Not outside where frost belonged. Inside. My breath had frozen against the glass, while I slept, turning into delicate white patterns that caught the dawn light like lace made of ice. I sat up slowly and watched the thin crystalline flowers melt as the stove warmed the air. Winter was already in the cabin with me, already touching my breath, my skin, the space where I thought I was safe. The walls weren't barriers, they were suggestions. The realization settled into my bones with the cold. This cabin would not protect me. It would only slow my death. The flock ranged across the hills north of the Musselshell River. 240 sheep moved through the fading summer grass with steady purpose. I walked beside them each morning and brought them back toward the barn before dusk. I'd grown up around sheep in Ohio back when my father still pretended to be a farmer between drinking and disappearing. I knew their habits. The oldest ewes guided the younger ones toward the best grazing without needing direction. The animals read the land better than most people ever would. In late September, I began shearing the youngest lambs. The work was loud and physical. Wool came away in thick, oily sheets that smelled of earth and animals and the sharp sweetness of lanolin, the natural grease that coated every fiber. My hands turned black within minutes, slick with the oil that made wool waterproof. The clean fleece I bundled carefully for the spring buyers. That was money. That was value. That was the arithmetic of survival turned into something I could hold. But the belly wool was different. Tangled with dirt and burrs, too uneven to sell matted with manure and grass seeds. The ranch usually burned it. I piled it in the corner of the cabin and forgot about it. One evening in late September, I sat beside the stove with my coat pulled tight around my shoulders. The room sat at 41 degrees, warmer than the outside air, but still cold enough that my breath showed faintly in the candlelight. I stared at the north wall, the side that faced the winter wind. In the dim glow, I could see every thin seam between the wooden boards. Frost traced the worst gaps in pale white lines. 7 visible leaks. 7 places where winter would enter and fill the cabin with cold that no amount of stove heat could fight. My eyes drifted toward the pile of waste wool in the corner. Garbage. Worthless. The kind of thing you burned or buried or left for the wind to scatter. The thought came quietly, not like inspiration, like observation. Two things in the same room. One was a problem. One was something nobody valued, unless the value wasn't in what it was, but in what it could become. I stood and carried a handful of fleece to the wall. The wool was thick and sticky with lanolin. When I squeezed it, the fibers compressed and then slowly expanded again, like something alive trying to breathe. I pushed the fleece into the largest crack between the boards. The draft stopped instantly. I held my hand there for a long moment, barely breathing. Still air. Not slower air. No air at all. Complete stillness where there had been a constant stream of cold pouring through. I pulled the wool out slowly and studied the fibers. They clung slightly to the wood where the grease touched the rough boards. When I released them, they held their shape inside the gap, springy and dense. A memory surfaced from childhood. An old woman in Ohio pressing greasy wool into the seams of a farmhouse wall. I'd been maybe 7 years old, watching from the doorway while my grandmother worked. Her voice explaining that the grease kept out dampness and the fibers trapped warm air in thousands of tiny pockets. Still, air doesn't move. Still, air holds warmth. That's what keeps you alive. I looked at the wool in my hands, the same principle Samuel Briggs had described when he talked about expensive insulation you could buy. Except wool cost almost nothing, less than nothing. It was garbage. I spent the rest of the evening testing the idea carefully. Lanolin repelled water. That meant the wool wouldn't rot the way Ryan Walker's straw had. The notebook had been clear about that failure. Rain soaked the straw. Cold froze it. The cabin filled with damp rot and freezing air. But wool was different. The crimped fibers trapped still air, and still air was what held warmth inside a building. The grease made it waterproof. The structure made it springy. The waste made it free. I decided to try it on one wall. Just one. Test the hypothesis before committing. If it failed, I'd know before I'd wasted all the wool. If it worked well, then the arithmetic might change. For 2 weeks, I worked every evening after tending the sheep. I nailed thin wooden strips across the walls and packed the fleece behind them, compressing the wool until it held firm but still thick enough to trap air. The cabin slowly began to smell strongly of lanolin. My hands turned permanently black with grease. I stopped trying to wash it off. The grease was the point. By mid-October, 2 walls were finished, the north wall and the west wall, the 2 sides that faced the prevailing wind. I stood in the center of the cabin and pressed my palm against the north wall. Cool, yes, but not the knife-edge cold of bare wood. Not the deep biting chill that had made frost form on the inside of the window. Something had changed. The wall had become a barrier instead of a sieve. The stove burned low. Inside the cabin, the temperature held at 41 degrees, while the outside air dropped to 20. For the first time since arriving in Montana, I allowed myself to believe that the numbers might change. 3 cords of wood. 63 pounds of wool. Maybe that was enough. But winter hadn't spoken yet, and I knew better than to trust possibility over arithmetic. Hope was just mathematics you hadn't finished calculating. Early September had brought something else I hadn't expected. On the 8th day of the month, a woman rode up to the cabin on a bay mare that looked better fed than most people. She was maybe 28 with dark hair braided tight and eyes that assessed the cabin, the sheep, and me in about 3 seconds. Her voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd learned to make decisions quickly. "You're the new herder at Moore's Line Camp." Yes, Rebecca Clark. Laura Hill. I run sheep with my father down by Antelope Creek, 8 miles south. Heard someone new took the job. She dismounted and tied her horse to the fence post with efficient movements. Wanted to warn you. Warn me about what? Laura gestured at the cabin. This place. 3 herders in 3 years. None made it through winter. The confirmation settled heavy. I'd suspected as much from the notebook, from Kathleen's careful warnings, from the way Kenneth Taylor had looked at me like I was already dead. But hearing it stated plainly was different. What happened to them? First one 2 years ago left in November, just packed up and rode out before the real cold hit. Smart if you ask me. Second one, that was Ryan Walker, they found him in January. Frozen. She paused, watching my reaction. Third one lasted until February, but he got frostbite so bad, they had to take 3 fingers and both feet. He lived, but he's done with Montana. I kept my voice steady, even as my stomach turned. And you think I should leave? Laura's expression shifted, something complicated crossing her face. I think you should know what you're facing. My father thinks I'm visiting Moore Ranch right now. He doesn't know I came here. He doesn't think women should be herding alone. Says it's not safe. The irony in her voice was sharp enough to cut. But I've been doing it anyway since I was 16, so maybe I'm not the one to tell you to quit. Something loosened in my chest, the first breath of recognition, someone who understood. Your father lets you herd. My father needs me to herd. His hip is bad, has been for 5 years. He can manage the barn work, but he can't walk 15 miles a day with the flock. So he lets me do it and pretends it's temporary. Laura's smile was thin. Men are good at pretending things are temporary when they need those things to be permanent. I found myself smiling back despite everything. What's your advice? Check for wolf tracks every morning. Watch for sheep bloat after they eat wet clover. Winterberry will poison them. There's a patch about 2 miles northeast of here. Keep the flock clear. She paused, studying the cabin again. And if you make it to November, I'll come back and we'll talk about making it to December. Laura left as the sun set. I watched her ride south until she disappeared into the grassland. For the first time since arriving in Montana, I felt something other than fear. Not quite hope, but maybe solidarity. Someone else understood what it meant to be a woman doing work. Men said we couldn't. The arithmetic was still impossible. 3 cords of wood wouldn't last 16 weeks, but at least I knew I wasn't the only one calculating survival in a place that didn't particularly care whether I lived or died. The wool-lined walls changed the cabin in ways I could measure and ways I couldn't. The temperature held steadier. The wind didn't whistle through anymore. The stove's heat stayed inside instead of pouring out through invisible gaps. But the real change was quieter. I stopped waking up with frost on the inside of the window. Stopped feeling that constant presence of winter breathing down my neck. The cabin still wasn't warm. It still wasn't safe, but it had become something closer to shelter than it had been before. I finished the last wall in late October. All 4 walls and the ceiling lined with 63 pounds of waste wool that everyone had agreed was garbage. I stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, studying my work. The wooden strips I'd nailed across the walls gave the place a strange ribbed appearance, like being inside the belly of some enormous animal. My hands were permanently stained black with lanolin. The cabin smelled like sheep and grease, and something faintly sweet that I couldn't quite identify. But when I pressed my palm against the north wall, the side that faced the winter wind, the side that had leaked cold like a wound bleeding, the surface felt cool but solid. The stove burned low. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. Inside, it held at 43. The arithmetic had changed, not enough to guarantee survival, but enough to make it possible. I sat down beside the stove and allowed myself one moment of something that might have been hope or might have just been exhaustion. 3 cords of wood, 63 pounds of wool. The distance between dying in January and making it to April was narrowing, but winter was coming, and Montana didn't care how clever I thought I'd been. It just waited. November arrived 3 weeks after Christopher Lewis first rode up to the cabin. He was tall, mid-30s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent enough Montana winters to respect what they could do. When he stepped through the door, his eyes went straight to the wool-lined walls. His fingers ran across the compressed fleece, feeling the density and spring. Lanolin, smart, keeps moisture out. My shoulders tensed, waiting for the skepticism that always came. You know about wool insulation. My grandfather used it in Norway. Packed wool between double walls on the winter barns. Christopher turned slowly, studying the ceiling, the corners where I'd forced extra padding. I've been meaning to try it here, but never got around to it. Mind if I watch you work? The question caught me off guard. Not dismissal, not condescension, just practical curiosity from someone who recognized a solution when he saw one. I'm finished with the cabin, but I need to do the sheep barn before real cold hits. Christopher nodded once decisive. I'll help you finish it in exchange for learning the technique. My barn has the same problem whined through the boards. Lost 12 head last winter to cold that shouldn't have killed them. We worked together over the next 3 days. He didn't waste words, didn't question my methods, didn't treat the work like something I needed help with, versus something we were doing together. His hands moved with the same efficient patience I'd developed nailing strips and packing fleece, with enough pressure to compress, but not enough to destroy the air pockets that made it work. On the 3rd evening, we finished the barn. 237 sheep I'd lost 3 to a wolf in early October now had shelter that might actually keep them alive through January. Christopher stepped back and studied the walls with the critical eye of someone calculating odds. If this works, I'm insulating my barn the same way. You might have solved something people have been struggling with for years. I wanted to believe him, but belief didn't change the fact that 3 cords of wood still had to last until April, and the calendar was moving faster than the pile of firewood was shrinking. Winter hasn't spoken yet. No. His voice carried the weight of too many seasons watching good plans fail. But you've given yourself a better chance than most. After Christopher left, the cabin felt different. Not because of the insulation that had already changed the temperature, but because for 3 days I'd worked alongside someone who didn't treat me like I was performing some kind of circus act by being a woman alone in Montana. The silence that returned when he rode away had edges I hadn't noticed before. Late October brought a different kind of visitor. I heard him before I saw him, traps clanging from the back of a mule, the animal picking its way through the scrub grass east of the property line. The man was maybe 40 rough in the particular way of someone who'd stopped caring what other people thought about 15 years ago. He didn't dismount, just sat his mule and looked at the cabin, the barn, the sheep grazing the near hills. You the lady herder, Rebecca Clark. This is Kathleen Moore's land. Gary Young. I trap wolves. Had permission from the previous owner to work this range. My jaw tightened. Previous owner is dead. Current owner is Kathleen Moore. You need her permission, not mine. Gary's smile showed teeth gone brown from tobacco. Lady herders don't last. I'll be here long after you're gone. Might as well get used to seeing me around. He rode off before I could respond, heading east toward the boundary where Moore's land met open range. The traps clanged with each step. The mule took a sound like chains dragging. 2 weeks later, I found one of my ewes caught in a leg-hold trap near the eastern fence line. The animal was still alive, but her front leg was mangled bone visible through torn flesh. She made a sound I'd never heard a sheep make before, high and constant, more like screaming than bleeding. I shot her, put the rifle barrel against her head, and pulled the trigger because it was the only mercy left to give. Then I looked at the trap. Steel jaws, crude but effective. Initials stamped into the metal GY. Gary Young's trap. On land that bordered Kathleen's property, but sat just far enough into open range that legally he could claim he had the right to set it there. I rode to the Hartwell Ranch that afternoon with the trap loaded on my saddle. Kathleen listened while I explained, her face unmoving. "I'll handle it." Her tone was flat final. "But legally, he can trap on open range near the property line. Keep your flock away from the eastern boundary." The words landed like a door closing. "He killed one of your sheep. And I'll deduct the cost from what he owes me for wool storage." Kathleen's eyes met mine with something that might have been sympathy or might have just been exhaustion. "I know it's not justice, but it's the arithmetic that matters. One sheep versus a legal fight I can't win. I choose keeping the other 236 alive." I rode back to the line camp with my hands shaking on the reins. Injustice had a particular taste, bitter like copper. I'd tasted it when factories paid men twice what they paid women for the same work. Tasted it when my brother's death was worth $12 and a foreman's apology. Now I tasted it again, watching a man's word carry more weight than evidence stamped in his own initials. That night, I sat alone in the cabin and let myself ask the question I'd been avoiding since Chicago. What if I'd been wrong? What if I should have stayed, taken the factory job at $8 a week, accepted safe poverty instead of gambling everything on Montana arithmetic that kept trying to kill me? The stove crackled. Outside wind moved through the grass with a sound like water. Inside, the temperature held at 45 degrees, while November cold pressed against the walls. I didn't have an answer, just the knowledge that asking the question meant I was tired enough to doubt, and doubt was the first step toward giving up. The mockery came in early November when I rode to White Sulphur Springs for more waste wool. I needed another 20 pounds to finish insulating the grain storage shed. Kenneth Taylor had it waiting his own ranch's shearing leftover stuff they usually composted. Outside the mercantile, a man stood holding court with 3 others, his voice loud enough to carry across the street. Donald Harris. I recognized him from Kenneth's descriptions. Largest cattle rancher in the valley, the kind of man who measured his worth in how many heads of livestock he could point to and call his own. His eyes tracked me as I approached the store, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, opportunity. The particular look of someone who'd just found an audience for a performance. "You're the one filling her cabin with sheep wool." I kept walking, but his voice rose, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "I've seen sheep outfits come and go in this county for 20 years. Every time they fail, the grass grows back and the cattle move in again. Nature's way of correcting mistakes." The men around him laughed. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The sound of people grateful someone else was the joke. I stopped and turned to face him. "I'll see you in spring." Harris's smile widened. "No, you won't." He paused for effect, making sure everyone was listening. "Woman alone in a line camp. It's not natural. You're taking a job from a man who needs it, who has a family to feed, but you'll be gone before Christmas and things will go back to how they should be." The words hung in the cold air. Every eye on the street was watching now, waiting to see if I'd argue or cry or prove him right by breaking. I walked into the store with my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. He was right about one thing. I was alone, but he was wrong that it made me weak. Alone meant no one could stop me from trying. Kenneth was waiting inside his expression, carefully neutral. Harris has been wrong before. His voice was quiet, meant only for me. But he's not wrong about the cold. November's just the preview. January's the test. I paid for the wool and rode back to the line camp with my hands steady on the reins and my chest tight with something that felt less like anger and more like fuel. Donald Harris thought I'd be gone by Christmas. The arithmetic said he might be right, but arithmetic could change if you found the right variable to shift. The first real snow fell on November 4th. 2 inches by morning, 4 by nightfall. It looked almost gentle the way it softened the landscape and made everything quiet. But the temperature didn't rise afterward, the way it had in October. The cold stayed settling into the valley like it was claiming territory. The Musselshell River began freezing along its shallow edges. Ice formed in delicate sheets that broke when I pushed them with a stick, but reformed overnight thicker each time. The sheep moved more carefully through the snow, stepping slowly, while the oldest ewes guided the flock towards slopes where grass still pushed through the thin white cover. Every evening, I brought them back to the barn and counted. 236. One less than I'd started November with, but the arithmetic of survival had to allow for some loss. Wolves' weather accidents, you couldn't prevent everything. You could only try to keep the losses small enough that the numbers on the other side still added up to viable. November 22nd arrived with a gray shadow across the northern sky. By early afternoon, the temperature had already dropped from 15 above to 11 below zero. A change of 26 degrees in 4 hours. The air felt different too, not just cold but pressure like the atmosphere itself was compressing. I pushed the flock into the barn early, counted twice to be sure, then barred the door and crossed the short distance back to the cabin. The wind hit me halfway there, strong enough to shove me sideways. Snow no longer fell straight down. It moved horizontally across the valley in thick white sheets that erased distance and direction at the same time. Inside the cabin, I sealed the door with cloth stuffed into the gaps and sat beside the stove. The wind roared outside like something alive and angry, but the cold stayed outside. I placed my hand against the north wall and felt cool wood. Yes, but not the deep biting cold of bare boards. The wool held. The stove burned slowly exactly the way I'd calculated. For hours, the cabin remained steady. Temperature inside 31 degrees. Temperature outside 11 below. The arithmetic was working. Near midnight, I felt a draft. It came from the northwest corner close to the floor, a narrow stream of air, cold enough to numb my fingers within seconds. I moved the candle along the wall until the flame bent sideways. A seam had opened between 2 boards, less than half an inch wide, but in a Montana blizzard that was enough to let winter pour through like water finding a crack in a dam. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. This was how it started. 1 gap, then 2. Then the cold flooded in, and the cabin became Ryan Walker's tomb. I worked quickly, pulling fleece from the reserve pile and forcing it into the opening. My hands shook from cold or fear or both. I nailed a strip of wood across the seam to hold it tight. The draft stopped. I checked the rest of the wall, carefully running my hands along every joint, every corner. Found 2 smaller gaps and sealed them too. By 1 in the morning, the interior temperature had climbed back to 31 degrees. Outside, the thermometer read 18 below and falling. The storm lasted 3 more days. Snowdrifts piled 4 feet high against the north wall of the cabin. The packed snow formed another layer of insulation, holding warmth inside even better than before. But the world outside had become something inhuman. The kind of cold that turned breath to ice before it could leave your mouth. When the storm finally ended on November 26th, I ventured out to check the barn. The sheep were huddled together for warmth but alive. I counted carefully. 235. One lost an old ewe I found in the corner, simply dead. No visible injury, no sign of struggle, just age and cold, and the arithmetic of survival allowing one more subtraction. I stood in the barn with my hands shaking and let myself feel the victory and the grief at the same time. The wool had worked. The cabin had held. I had survived the first real test. But I was down to 235 sheep when I'd promised Kathleen I'd keep 240 alive. December arrived with the kind of cold that made every breath an effort. Laura Hill didn't visit as promised. By the 10th of the month, I was worried enough to ride south to Antelope Creek. I found their cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, which meant someone was alive. But when Laura opened the door, her face was drawn tight with exhaustion. My father, he's sick. Bedridden for 2 weeks. I looked past her into the dim interior and saw an old man propped on pillows, his breathing labored and wet. What does the doctor say? Can't afford the doctor. Can't afford to leave him alone long enough to get one anyway. Laura's voice cracked slightly. I'm running our 180 sheep and trying to keep him alive, and I can't... She stopped, jaw working. I can't do both much longer. The decision came quickly, the way all survival decisions did, when you stopped trying to calculate perfect outcomes. Combine the flocks. I'll herd both until your father recovers. You stay with him. Laura's eyes widened. You have your own sheep to manage. I have a wool-lined barn. Yours don't. My flock can weather storms better. Yours need daily care or they'll drift and you'll lose them. I met her gaze steadily. Makes sense, that's all. For 3 weeks, I herded 415 sheep, 235 mine 180 Laura's. The work was exhausting in ways that made my previous routine feel like leisure. Up before dawn, walking 15 miles a day through snow that got deeper, every week counting and recounting to make sure none strayed. But something shifted during those weeks. Laura's father recovered slowly, and when Laura could finally leave him for a few hours to help with the flock, we worked in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. She understood what I understood, that strength wasn't refusing help. It was knowing when to give it. On December 28th, wolves hit the combined flock during evening grazing. I heard the sheep scatter before I saw the gray shapes moving through them. I fired the rifle twice, aiming high to scare rather than kill. The wolves broke off, but the damage was done. 3 sheep dead, 1 of mine, 2 of Laura's. The animals had been torn open, more butchery than feeding. Wolves testing defenses, seeing what they could take. Laura and I buried the carcasses in shallow graves, the frozen ground barely accepted. She worked in silence, her face unreadable. Finally, you saved most of them. Thank you. I looked at the graves and felt the weight of those subtractions. 234 sheep remaining for me, 178 for Laura. The arithmetic kept shifting and every loss narrowed the margin. By New Year's, Laura's father was strong enough to manage on his own again. We separated the flocks, and she rode south with her animals following. Before she left, she pressed something into my hand, a small cloth bag of peppermint candy, the expensive kind that came from back east. For getting through December. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. If you need help in January, send word. I'll come. After she left, I sat in the cabin and ate one piece of peppermint, letting the sweetness dissolve slowly on my tongue. For the first time since my mother died, I felt like I had something close to a friend. Not family, not obligation, just someone who understood what it cost to survive in a place that didn't particularly care if you did. January arrived with cold that moved differently than November's storms. No wind, no snow, just silence that filled the valley in a way that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. The thermometer outside the cabin read 22 below zero. Inside 34 degrees. The wool was still working, still holding the line between survivable and fatal. But Christopher Lewis had warned me about deeper cold. 40 below, the kind that ended arguments. On January 8th, I saw the storm coming. It moved across the sky like a wall, swallowing the Judith Mountains. Gray-black clouds so low they seemed to scrape the earth. The air pressure changed, making my ears pop. I pushed the sheep into the barn hours before dusk, triple-checking that every gap was sealed, every water trough filled. Back in the cabin, I stacked extra wood beside the stove and stuffed cloth into every seam I could reach. Then, I sat down to wait. The storm hit at midnight. Snow struck the cabin sideways, wind hammering against the boards with enough force to make the whole structure shudder. The stove burned constantly, eating through wood faster than I wanted, but slower than I feared. By 3 a.m, the temperature outside had fallen to 31 below, inside 28 degrees. Before dawn on January 9th, the mercury in the thermometer retreated completely into the bulb. That meant the temperature had fallen beyond 50 below zero, the worst cold Montana had seen in years. I fed the stove carefully, watching every piece of wood disappear into flame. My hands were numb, even inside gloves. My breath froze in the air before it could reach the wall, creating tiny ice crystals that fell like dust. The cabin held at 18 degrees, barely survivable, the kind of cold that made thinking slow and movement painful. I wrapped myself in raw fleece and huddled by the stove, and understood with absolute clarity that this was how Ryan Walker had died. Slowly, in the cold, feeding a stove that couldn't keep up with physics. I prayed. Not to God exactly. I'd stopped believing in that kind of help when my mother died screaming from typhoid. But to something. Mathematics. The lanolin in the wool, the density of trapped air. Anything that might tip the balance 1 degree in my favor. At 10 a.m. on January 10th, I heard something outside. Faint, rhythmic. Not wind, not animals. Something deliberate. 4 strikes against the cabin wall. Pause. 3 more. No wind made that sound. No accident created that pattern. I opened the door and Christopher Lewis fell through it more corpse than man. Snow had frozen across his coat in sheets of ice. His beard was solid white. His hands were the color of old newspaper. I caught him before he hit the floor, bright-eyed him inside, slammed the door against the cold that tried to follow. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. I wrapped his frozen hands in raw wool. The lanolin would help circulation and brought warm water slowly to his mouth. Too fast, and the heat would kill him as surely as the cold. For hours, he shook beside the stove while warmth returned to his body. I kept feeding him water, kept the wool wraps tight, kept checking his fingers for the black that would mean frostbite had won. By evening, color had returned to his hands. His voice came back rough and broken. Walked 6 miles. Barn roof collapsed. Couldn't stay. You walked through 63 below. Knew where your cabin was. Knew you'd have heat. He paused, breath still ragged. How did you know I was in trouble? I hadn't. I'd just been trying to survive my own arithmetic. But looking at him now, half dead from cold, that should have killed him completely, I understood something I hadn't before. Survival wasn't just personal mathematics. Sometimes it was building something that could save someone else when they needed it most. You helped me insulate the barn. Seemed fair to return the favor. Christopher stayed 5 days while the storm continued. During that time, the temperature dropped even further. 63 degrees below zero. The coldest Montana had been in recorded history. Outside, the world became something alien. Metal snapped. Trees exploded from ice inside their trunks. Cattle froze where they stood, too cold to even fall over when they died. Inside the cabin, the stove burned constantly. Wood disappeared into flame faster than I wanted to calculate, but the wool held. The temperature inside never dropped below 9 degrees above zero. It was barely enough, but barely was still alive. On February 2nd, the storm finally ended. Christopher was strong enough to walk. I helped him saddle his horse, made sure he had enough fleece wrapped around his core to survive the ride back to what was left of his property. Before he left, his words came quiet. You saved my life. You would have done the same. Maybe. His eyes met mine with something that looked like respect or gratitude or just exhausted recognition. But you actually did it, in 63 below. That's not luck, Rebecca. That's will. After he rode away, I walked to the barn to check the sheep. The counting took longer than usual because my hands were shaking and my eyes kept losing focus. 221. 13 lost during the 5-day storm. I found 3 of the oldest ewes dead in the corner age and cold, and the simple arithmetic of systems failing. 8 had been crushed when the storm wind forced the barn door open briefly during the worst of it, creating a panic stampede in the dark. 2 had simply vanished wolves, most likely taking advantage of the chaos. I stood in the barn and counted 3 more times to be sure. 221 sheep, 19 lost total since November. I'd promised Kathleen 240. I'd failed that arithmetic, but I'd lived, and so had Christopher. Somehow, that felt like the only mathematics that mattered. I walked to the eastern edge of the property and looked across at Donald Harris's land. The snow had finally stopped, and the afternoon sun cut across the valley with light that held no warmth. Hundreds of dead cattle lay scattered across his range, frozen solid, some still standing upright like statues. The Great Die-Up, that's what people would call it later. The winter that ended the cattle empires and changed the northern plains forever. Harris had been wrong about me leaving before Christmas, but his cattle were still dead, and I was still alive, standing on frozen ground, breathing air that hurt my lungs, looking at evidence that wealth and arrogance couldn't survive what 63 pounds of garbage wool could. The difference wasn't money or gender or even experience. It was asking what something worthless could become instead of accepting what everyone agreed it was. I turned and walked back to the cabin. Inside, the temperature had already dropped to 30 degrees now that the stove wasn't burning constantly. I added wood and watched the flames catch. Outside, February cold pressed against the walls. Inside, wool that everyone had agreed was trash kept winter from killing me. The arithmetic had changed. Not the way I'd hoped 19 sheep lost felt like failure, even though survival felt like victory. But the numbers that mattered most were still in my favor. 221 animals alive, 3 cords of wood down to 1. 6 weeks until April. The distance between 1 cord and 6 weeks was still impossible, but I'd made impossible work before. Maybe I could do it again. February brought ranchers. They rode up singly or in pairs, dismounting in the yard and standing there like supplicants at a shrine. Men who'd spent decades telling themselves they knew Montana better than anyone now stood in front of a cabin lined with sheep waste and asked how it worked. I showed them the walls, let them press their palms against the compressed fleece and feel the difference between insulated boards and bare wood. Explained the principle of trapped air, the waterproofing properties of lanolin, the reason wool didn't rot the way straw did. They listened with the careful attention of people who'd just lost everything and were trying to understand why I hadn't. For months, I'd been the crazy woman. Now I was the expert they needed. The shift was dizzying, like standing on ground that kept changing elevation, but expertise didn't pay debts. Every rancher who came wanted free advice, free wool, free labor to line their own buildings. They'd nod along while I explained the method, then ask if I could help implement it. As if survival knowledge should come without cost because I was a woman who should be grateful for their attention. By mid-February, I'd started charging $5 for a consultation, $10 if they wanted me to supervise installation. The first man who heard the price laughed in my face. "You're asking money to teach something you figured out by accident?" My jaw tightened, but my voice stayed level. "I figured it out by almost dying. That's worth something." He paid. March arrived with the kind of cold that should have been February's, but arrived late like winter wanted one more chance to kill what it had missed. The temperature dropped back into the 20s below zero for 3 days straight, but the cabin held. The one remaining cord of wood stretched further than physics should have allowed because the wool kept the heat from bleeding away. On March 19th, I rode to White Sulphur Springs with a specific purpose. The land office sat next to the courthouse, a small building that smelled like old paper and the particular bureaucracy of men deciding who got to own what. Robert Williams sat behind the desk, with the tired expression of someone who'd processed the same paperwork for 15 years and expected to process it for 15 more. He looked up when I entered, eyes assessing my worn coat and wind-burned face. "Help you. I want to file a homestead claim." His pen stopped mid-stroke. "You married?" "No." "Then you can't file. Homestead Act requires head of household. That's a man or a widow." I'd expected this. Had spent 2 weeks reading and rereading the actual text of the 1862 Homestead Act in Kenneth Taylor's store where he kept a copy of federal land law for customers who needed to reference it. "The law says any citizen who is head of a household can file." I looked it up. There's no gender requirement in the original act, only that you're 21 and a citizen. I'm 23 and American-born. Robert's expression shifted from tired to annoyed. "That's technically true, but no woman has filed here without a husband or being a widow. It's not how we do things." "Then I'll be the first." He set his pen down carefully like he was placing a weapon on the table between us. "Miss Clark, I don't think you understand how this works. Even if I process your claim, you'd have to prove up the land. Build a dwelling, cultivate acreage, reside there for 5 years. That's work for a man with capital and help. You're a woman who survived the worst winter Montana's ever seen, while men with more money and more experience froze to death around me. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't pull them back. Process my claim, or I'll write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena and explain why you refuse to follow federal law. The silence stretched tight. Robert's jaw worked. Finally, he pulled out the necessary forms with movements that suggested each one physically pained him. Where's the land? 160 acres along the Musselshell River, north of Moore's Ranch, east of the line camp. He wrote slowly, making me wait for each stroke of the pen. When he finally pushed the completed form across the desk, his voice was flat. You'll need to file improvements within 6 months. Dwelling cultivation residence. Miss even one requirement and the claim reverts to public domain. I signed the form, with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. Walked out of that office with a claim number written on paper that meant I had permission to try. Not ownership yet, not security, just the legal right to attempt the impossible. Outside, the March wind cut through my coat, but I stood there on the wooden walkway and let myself feel something close to triumph. The arithmetic was changing in ways that went beyond survival. I was building toward permanence. Kathleen Moore rode to the line camp in late March, with the first real warmth of the year beginning to soften the snow. She dismounted slowly, favoring her left hip in a way I hadn't noticed before. We walked the perimeter of the property together while she studied the sheep. 221 animals thinner than they'd been in November, but alive, moving with the cautious energy of creatures who'd survived something they shouldn't have. Her voice came quiet when she finally spoke. I expected maybe 100 if you were very lucky. I lost 19 and saved 221 in the worst winter Montana's ever recorded. Kathleen's eyes moved from the flock to the cabin, taking in the wool-lined walls visible through the open door. The wool worked. Yes. She turned to face me fully, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not quite respect, she'd respected me enough to hire me, but recognition. The look of someone seeing an equal where they'd expected to find an employee. Every rancher in 3 counties wants to know how you did it. That's worth something. So here's my offer. You keep all 221 sheep plus 19 replacements from my breeding stock to get you back to 240. I give you a 3-year land lease at reduced rate. You teach the wool insulation method to my other line camps. We split wool sales 70-30 in your favor. The mathematics clicked into place immediately. Wool sales from 240 sheep would bring maybe $400 a year. 70% of that was $280. More money than I'd ever had at once in my life. Why the 70-30 split? You could demand 50-50 and I'd still take it. Kathleen's smile was thin. Because you're the one who figured out how to not die. I'm just the one smart enough to hire people smarter than me. She paused. You remind me of myself 30 years ago, desperate enough to try anything, smart enough to make it work. Most people are one or the other, rarely both. What if I fail? You already didn't fail. Everything after survival is just details. I accepted. Laura Hill arrived 2 weeks later on an afternoon when the snow was finally melting in earnest, turning the trails into mud that sucked at the horses' hooves. She rode up with her back straight and something light in her expression I hadn't seen before. My father's completely recovered. The sheep all survived minus the 2 we lost to wolves, and he apologized to me. I set down the fence post I'd been repairing. Apologized for what? For not trusting that I could run the operation as well as any son would have. Laura dismounted, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd just won an argument that had lasted a decade. He's making me a full partner. Equal say in all decisions. Equal share of profits. We stood there in the mud and melting snow, two women who'd survived a winter that killed cattle ranchers with 10 times our resources. Laura's smile was genuine, unguarded, in a way I'd never seen from her before. You know what that means? He admitted I was right. I've waited 10 years to hear him say those words. What will you do now? Run the operation with him. Build it bigger. Maybe buy more land when we can afford it. She paused, studying my face. What about you? I told her about the homestead claim, the partnership with Kathleen, the plan to build a proper cabin on my own land. Laura listened with the focused attention of someone calculating odds and finding them favorable. You'll need help building. I'm good with carpentry. My father taught me that much at least. I can pay. Laura waved the words away. You herded my sheep for 3 weeks when I couldn't. We're even. Besides, it'll feel good to build something instead of just trying to keep things from falling apart. Watching her ride away later, I understood something I hadn't before. Survival wasn't just personal victory. It was proof that carried weight beyond yourself. Laura's father had believed her because I'd proven a woman could do the work. And now she was free in ways that went beyond simple arithmetic. April brought Donald Harris. I saw him from a distance, first a lone rider approaching from the east across land that should have been full of cattle, but was instead empty except for bones. He rode slowly like someone who'd learned that rushing got you nowhere worth going. He didn't dismount at first, just sat his horse and looked at the cabin, the barn, the sheep grazing the new spring grass. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Quieter. The performance was gone. I lost 300 head. Everything. Bank owns the land now. I'm leaving Montana next week. I set down the bucket of water I'd been carrying to the trough. Where will you go? Back east. Find work in a city somewhere. Die with a roof over my head instead of freezing in a field. His eyes moved across the flock, counting automatically the way ranchers always did. I came to ask how you did it, not to mock, just to know. Every instinct I had said to let him suffer, let him feel what humiliation tasted like, what it meant to be dismissed and proven wrong. But then, I thought about Ryan Walker's notebook, about knowledge dying with the people who held it, about all the ways winter killed that had nothing to do with cold. Come inside. I showed him the wool-lined walls, explained the principle of lanolin waterproofing and trapped air insulation, let him touch the compressed fleece and feel how it held firm but springy dense, but breathable. He asked questions that showed he was actually listening, not just waiting for his turn to talk. When he finished examining the walls, he stood in the center of the cabin and his shoulders dropped in a way that looked like surrender. You were right. I didn't see you in spring. I saw something I didn't expect. What's that? Someone who understood this land better than I did. The words came slow, like each one cost something. Better than someone who'd been here 20 years and thought he had it figured out. The admission hung in the air between us. I could leave it there, let him carry it back east as a lesson learned too late. Or I could do something that felt less like justice and more like the kind of practicality that kept knowledge alive. Sheep wool won't help cattle much, but if you're willing to try sheep instead, I can show you how to insulate calving barns. Might save the next generation even if you lost this one. Harris's head came up, surprise evident. Why would you help me after what I said? Because Winter didn't care about pride. Because survival knowledge hoarded was survival knowledge wasted. Because I'd learned that asking what something worthless could become mattered more than remembering what cruel thing someone had said 6 months ago. But what I actually answered was simpler. Because survival shouldn't be a secret. He left an hour later with notes written in careful handwriting and a look on his face that suggested he was recalculating every assumption he'd built his life on. I never saw him again. Heard later he'd lost the land to the bank anyway, but the sheep operation kept him afloat enough to become a sharecropper on someone else's property. Humbled, but alive. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even forgiveness exactly. Just the practical mathematics of not letting useful knowledge die when someone needed it. Summer 1887 arrived with heat that felt impossible after 6 months of cold. By late July, I was ready to start building. The homestead claim required a dwelling cultivation and residence within 6 months. That meant I needed a cabin finished before September. Christopher Lewis arrived first, riding up with timber already loaded on a wagon. Heard you filed a claim? Figured you'd need help building before winter. Laura came next with her father, both of them bringing tools and the kind of efficient carpentry knowledge that came from building and rebuilding in a place where mistakes cost lives. Kathleen sent 2 ranch hands and enough lumber to frame a structure twice the size of the line camp. We built through August heat that made the work brutal. 20 feet by 24. Double wall construction with a 4-inch cavity between inner and outer boards. We packed that cavity with wool from floor to ceiling, using the same method I'd developed, but applying it from the beginning instead of retrofitting failure. The wool insulation went in layers. Compress, but don't crush. Seal, but leave air pockets. The work was hot and sticky, lanolin coating our hands and making everything we touched smell like sheep. The ceiling got the same treatment, double layer of boards with wool packed between. The roof we reinforced with extra beams, learning from Christopher's collapsed barn that Montana snow didn't respect structures built to Eastern standards. By mid-September, the cabin was finished. Larger than anything I'd imagined owning. Solid in ways the line camp had never been. I stood in the center of the empty main room and pressed my palm against the wall. Cool, solid, no draft, no fear. Just walls that did what walls were supposed to do, keep the world out and warmth in. That night alone in the new cabin, with the door barred and a fire burning in the stove, I let myself cry for the first time since my mother died. Not from grief, exactly. From the sheer, exhausted relief of having survived long enough to build something permanent, something that might outlast me. I'd arrived in Montana with $7 and a death sentence written in arithmetic everyone agreed couldn't be changed. Now I stood in a cabin on land that was legally mine, with sheep that were legally mine with knowledge that ranchers across 3 counties were willing to pay for. The distance between those 2 realities felt larger than the miles between Chicago and Montana. Felt like the difference between accepting what something was and asking what it could become. Winter 1887 to 88 was milder than the previous year. The temperature dropped into the 30s below instead of the 60s, and while that was still cold enough to kill the careless or unlucky, it felt almost gentle after what I'd survived. I spent that winter in the new cabin with 255 sheep. The flock had grown from spring lambs. The stove burned steadily but not desperately. Wood usage stayed around 4 cords, total half what an uninsulated structure would have needed. The interior temperature never dropped below 40 degrees even during the coldest nights. On a January evening, I pulled out Ryan Walker's notebook and read it again by lamplight. His careful observations, his methodical testing of straw insulation, his final entry that ended mid-sentence because the cold had taken him before he could finish the thought. I opened my own notebook, a new one I'd started keeping for future herders who might need it. Wrote down everything I'd learned about wool insulation, lanolin properties, maintenance requirements. Made it detailed enough that someone could follow the instructions without me there to explain. On the last page, I wrote a title, Rebecca Clark, 1886 to 1887, Survival Notes. Below that, my final entry. If you're reading this, you're probably afraid. That's smart. Fear keeps you careful, but don't let fear make you blind. The answer to your problem might be in the corner looking like trash. Look again. Look differently. Ask what it could become. That question saved my life. I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf beside Ryan's. 2 notebooks, 2 winters, 2 different endings. His had stopped mid-sentence because winter won. Mine continued because I'd asked a different question about the same worthless wool. Spring 1888 brought wool sales that exceeded every projection. 255 sheep produced enough quality fleece to earn $425. After paying Kathleen her 30%, I had nearly $300 more money than I'd seen in my entire life before Montana. I saved $250 for emergencies, used $125 for property improvements, a proper barn, a root cellar deep enough that vegetables wouldn't freeze, fencing that could handle snow weight. In June, a letter arrived from a rancher in Wyoming. He'd heard about the wool insulation method and wanted to know if I'd consult on implementing it for his operation. He offered $10 for detailed written instructions, $20 if I'd come supervise installation. I wrote back with specifications so detailed he could build it himself. Charged $10. He paid. By August, I'd received 5 more requests. Word was spreading beyond Montana, carried by ranchers who'd survived the Great Die-Up and were looking for ways to prevent the next catastrophe. I charged for every consultation, every set of instructions, every hour of supervision. Kenneth Taylor, watching me count payment one afternoon in his store, offered observation in his quiet way. You're monetizing knowledge you learned by almost dying. That's sit right with you. I earned that knowledge. It has value. His smile was slight but genuine. Good. Most people give away what they worked hardest for. You're smarter than that. Summer also brought Gary Young back to the property line. I heard his traps before I saw him, the familiar clanging of steel against mulehide. He was setting them along the eastern boundary again, right where open range met my homestead claim. This time was different. This time I had federal papers that said the land was mine, not just Kathleen's. This time I could enforce boundaries. I rode to town and found the sheriff at his office, showed him the homestead claim documents, explained the trap situation, gave him coordinates for where Gary had set his lines. The sheriff, a man named Thomas Rodriguez, who'd been enforcing territorial law for 15 years, studied the papers carefully. These are filed proper. Federal claim supersedes open range access. I'll handle it. 3 days later, Gary Young rode past the cabin heading east, traps loaded and gone. He didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge the legal loss, just rode away with his jaw tight and his pride wounded. I stood in the yard and watched him disappear into the distance. It wasn't revenge, it was just enforcement. But watching him go, knowing my word carried legal weight, now felt like closing a circle that had opened when his trap killed my ewe back in October. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something permanent enough to defend. Late summer brought Kathleen Moore with an offer that shifted the arithmetic again. She rode up on a hot August afternoon, dismounting slowly with her hip clearly bothering her more than it had in spring. We sat in the shade of the cabin while she explained. I'm getting too old for this. The hip's not going to get better. I need someone to run sheep operations for the whole ranch, all the line camps, all the breeding stock, all the sales. Her eyes met mine with the same directness she'd shown the first day we met. $75 a month, continued land lease at no cost, percentage of total wool sales. You'd manage everything while I handle the business end from town. $75 a month meant $900 a year, plus percentage of sales could add another few hundred. I was looking at income that would have seemed like fantasy 2 years ago. What if I fail? Kathleen's laugh was short and genuine. You survived 63 below in a cabin held together with garbage wool. If that didn't kill you, managing some sheep won't either. I accepted. Signed papers that made me head of sheep operations for the largest ranch in Meeker County. Me who'd arrived with $7 and a borrowed job. The arithmetic kept changing, kept improving, kept proving that asking what something could become mattered more than accepting what everyone agreed it was. Fall brought Christopher Lewis with a business proposal. His sheep operation had grown substantially. He'd converted 60% from cattle after watching his entire herd freeze. The wool-insulated barn had saved his breeding stock, and now he was producing enough fleece to make sales profitable. We should pool resources. His voice carried the practical tone of someone presenting obvious mathematics. Combine our wool sales, negotiate bulk prices with buyers, share equipment, help each other during lambing season. Standard partnership structure. I studied him carefully, looking for the angle, the place where this would turn into something I didn't want. Why me instead of one of the other ranchers? Because you think like an engineer instead of a gambler. Because you understand that cooperation isn't weakness. And because... He paused, choosing words carefully. Because you're the only person I know who'd walk 6 miles through 63 below to check if someone needed help. The partnership was business. Pure mathematics of mutual benefit. No romance, no obligation beyond what the contract specified. We pooled our wool sales that year and negotiated prices 15% higher than individual ranchers could get. Split the profits evenly. Shared equipment maintenance costs. It worked because it was built on respect instead of sentiment, because we'd both learned that survival required seeing what things could become instead of accepting what they were. Standing on my 160 acres that October, I could see Christopher's land to the northeast, Laura's to the south, Kathleen's ranch spreading west. 300 sheep grazing my property wool-insulated cabin and barn, solid against the coming winter root cellar, full of enough food to last until spring. The view was different than it had been 2 years ago. Not just the buildings and fences and improvements, but the way the land itself felt less like enemy territory and more like something I'd learned to work with instead of against. People still asked how I'd survived that first winter. They wanted stories about courage or divine intervention or luck that couldn't be replicated. But the truth was stranger and simpler than any story they wanted to hear. I'd survived because I looked at 63 pounds of greasy wool everyone called worthless and asked a different question. Not what is this worth, but what could this become? Ryan Walker had looked at the same cabin, the same walls, the same problem. He'd tried straw. It failed. He froze. I tried wool. It worked. I lived. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't divine favor. It was willingness to see differently, to question what everyone agreed was garbage, to try what seemed stupid until it became smart. That distance between those two questions, between accepting value as fixed and seeing it as something that could change, was the same distance between dying in January and standing here in October, watching my sheep graze land I owned. Winter, 1888, came early, first snow falling in late November, but this time I was ready. The cabin was solid, the barn was reinforced. The flock was healthy, and the wool sales had left me with enough capital to handle any crisis short of catastrophe. On a December evening with snow falling outside and the stove burning steady, I sat at the table and read Ryan Walker's notebook one final time. His observations had been correct. His method had been logical. His execution had been careful. But his solution had been wrong, and wrong solutions killed you in Montana, no matter how smart you were when you implemented them. I opened my own notebook to the last page. Below my previous entry, I wrote one more line. The sentence Ryan had never finished. If you're reading this, I'm still alive. Because I asked what garbage could become. Try it. It might save you too. I placed both notebooks on the shelf side by side. His ending with death. Mine continuing. 2 winters, 2 approaches, 2 outcomes. The arithmetic was clear. Outside, the temperature dropped toward 0. Inside, the cabin held at 45 degrees. 300 sheep were safe in the wool-insulated barn. 1 cord of wood waited to be burned, but I had 2 more stacked and ready. The root cellar held enough food for 4 months. Everything I'd built, the cabin, the flock, the partnerships, the knowledge came from that single moment 2 years ago when I looked at waste fleece in the corner and asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. The Great Die-Up had killed cattle operations across the northern plains, ended empires built on assumptions that wealth and size and tradition mattered more than adaptation. But sheep ranching had spread across the region, carried by people who'd learned that survival required seeing value where others saw waste. My name was attached to the method now. Ranchers called it the Clark insulation technique, and the knowledge had traveled from Montana to Wyoming to the Dakotas. Carried by consultation fees I charged and instructions I wrote and demonstrations I gave to people willing to pay for expertise earned by almost dying. I'd arrived in Montana with $7 and arithmetic that said I would freeze to death before spring. Now I had land livestock income and partnerships built on mutual respect instead of desperation. The transformation wasn't miracle or luck. It was the result of asking what something worthless could become and being willing to try the answer even when everyone said it wouldn't work. February 1889 would mark 3 years since I'd stepped off that train platform with a single trunk and a letter of employment. 3 years since I'd thought survival meant lasting until spring. 3 years since I'd understood that the distance between 2 cords and 7 wasn't something hope could fill, but I'd filled it anyway. Not with hope. With wool and work and willingness to see differently. The stove crackled. Outside Montana, winter pressed against walls that no longer leaked. Inside, warmth held steady because 63 pounds of garbage had become the variable that changed impossible arithmetic into simple mathematics of survival. Sometimes the difference between a sentence already written and a story still being told is just asking the right question. Not what is this worth, but what could this become? I'd asked that question about waste wool and lived. That was all. But that was everything.